Okay. Hi, everyone. Um, Excited to jump into Sefer Yoel. Who's learned Yoel before? One of those very short Sfarim that we often don't pay attention to. It's only 4 little prakim, and we're actually not exactly sure when it takes place, because the beginning of the Sefer just says that God speaks to Yoel. It doesn't say where he is, which time period. So according to this Seder Olam, he's in the time period of Menashe, Melech Menashe of Ephraim. But many of the chokrim, many researchers believe that he's at the time of the beginning of Bayit Sheni, the second Beit HaMikdash, because he only mentions Yehuda, right, where the 10 tribes had already been dispersed. And also, he doesn't mention the sin of Avodah Zarah, which was a very rampant sin during the first temple, which is the time of Menashe. And here he doesn't mention that as any of the sins. So those are the reasons which really would lead us to believe that he's from that time period. But as we also understand from the Nevi'im, their message is eternal. So it was relevant for then, and it's also relevant for now. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at inside. We're only going to look at the concluding psukim, the last 4 psukim of the entire Sefer. And through Professor Eliyahu Assis, I think he has a very interesting look at these 4 psukim, which shines light on the entire Sefer. So just by looking at these 4 psukim, we can really understand what's going on. So we're going to look a lot into structure. So you're going to need to focus with me because we have some highlighting going on. And if you had your own Tanakh, I would tell you to take out your highlighters as well. Okay, so we're going to look at the structure, and through this, we're going to derive some of the meaning, okay? And basically, by understanding these psukim, we need to contemplate the structure here. So usually when the chokrim, when the researchers, when they look at these psukim, they see it as divided into 2 layers, right? The layer of the salvation of Israel, and the second layer is the fall of the enemies. Okay, so first we're going to look at it, and we're going to see that we're going to reveal extra additional layers to this structure. Okay, so he says here in Yoel, Perek Daled, Pasuk Yud Chet, Vaya Bayom Hahu, and they always talk about this Yom Hahu, this great day, which not always, but oftentimes refers to Acharit Hayamim, the end of days. Yitfu haharim asis. The mountains are going to drip with wine. V'hagvaot telachna chalav. And the hills are going to flow with milk. V'chol afike Yehuda yilchu maim. And all the water courses of Judah shall flow with water. U'ma'ayan mibeit Hashem yetze v'hishka et nachal hashitim. And a spring shall issue from the house of the Lord, and it's going to water the wadi of Shittim. Don't know how to say that in English, okay? So we have this pasuk, and then the next pasuk, you might say, Mahakesher, right? What's the connection? So let's see. Mitzrayim lishmama tihiyeh ve'edom limidbar shmama. So Mitzrayim is going to be a desolation, and Edom is going to be a desolate waste. Mechamas b'nei Yehuda asher shafchu dam naki be'artzam. Because of the outrage to the people of Judah, in whose land they shed the blood of the innocent. Pasuk Chaf, Yehuda leolam teshev Yerushalayim ledor vador. But Yehuda is going to be inhabited forever, and Yerushalayim throughout the generations. Pasuk Chaf Aleph, which is a little bit tricky, a little bit hard to understand. Veliketi damam lo niketi v'Hashem shochen b'Tzion. Thus I will treat as innocent their blood, which I have not treated as innocent. Okay, we'll get to that later. And Hashem will dwell in Zion. Okay. So aside from these 2 main focuses where we see here that there's the salvation of Israel and we see the destruction of our enemies, which are reflected here in Edom and Mitzrayim, we're going to look at the psukim, and we're going to see how he says that there's a structure here where Aleph is parallel to Aleph, Bet to Bet, right? The colors, they're parallel to one another. And through this, we're going to see what the central point here that stands at the foundation of these psukim in this one unit, okay? So if you look at the first psukim, right, you see in the Aleph and the Aleph, we'll call it by the colors, okay? So the two blues, which is the little Alephs, okay? We see that in here, that's where they're going to be dripping the wine, and here Mitzrayim is desolate. Okay, you see a contrast that the wine is dripping, right? Whereas the land in Mitzrayim and Edom, it's going to be desolate and really dry. Okay, then in the yellow parts, we see that the hills are going to have the milk. And here you see, and in the second part, so you see the flow of milk, the flow of a liquid. One is milk and the second one is blood. Okay, the third one we see pasuk gimel, not gimel, sorry, the letter gimel, the greens. V'chol afike Yehuda yilchu mayim, v'Yehuda li'olam teshev Yerushalayim l'dor v'dor. Here we're going to see that they're both focusing on Yehuda. Okay, and in the last place where it's talking about the spring that's coming from the Beit Hashem that's going to water the Nachal Shittim, and here Vashem Shochen B'Tzion at the last part, it's a reference to the place of God. Okay, so basically what Professor Elias sees is he's dividing this unit into two sections, and each section has 4 different parts, and they stand opposite one another in this linear structure that we've just seen. Okay, so what's the nature of the tie between these two parts? So if we look at the Aleph part, we just spoke about it on a more of a superficial level. If we look at it on a deeper level, that the future abundance of wine in the mountains, it's in sharp contrast to the desolation that's going to be predicted for Mitzrayim. Now, in the time where he's prophesying, the present time, there's desolation in Yehuda because of what Edom and Mitzrayim have done to them, the destruction that they've brought upon them. It's going to turn around. It's going to be a v'nahafochu, okay? If you look at the Bet part with the flow of the milk versus the flow of the blood, so the blood spill of the Yehuda by Mitzrayim and Edom, it's contrast to this great flow of milk that's going to be in the hills of Yehuda. And here he wants to claim that the tie between the flow of blood and the flow of milk is significant, because if you look at the first part, there's a flow of liquid in each of them. You see that there's milk and there's wine and there's water, but there's something here about milk if you look at the metaphorical meaning of milk. So you can have either, Buver says that the imagery is just, it's a description of this idea of milk. It's like in this abundance, this richness, that the Weinkoff says that the intention here is that it's showing that there's going to be not an abundance of milk, but an abundance of pasture, which is good for milk flow in the animals themselves, right? But if you expand this into other directions, you can also see that milk is symbolic of life, right? The beginning of a child's life, that's how they're sustained, through that milk, right? It's central there. So through this, we can understand then the parallel between the blood and the milk, because both of them are symbolic of life, right? Blood and milk, and blood is also connected with death as well. When we look at the third part, the little gimel, the green parts, the gimels, we see here Pasuk Yud Chet, it's describing this flow of water in Yehuda, and this expresses the nature of the place here of Yehuda as a place that's flowing with water, which will be the base, the foundation of the permanent settlement there in the future in Yerushalayim. Okay, as we can see in Pasuk Yud Tet, right, in the green there, that the future, it's going to say Yehuda li'olam teshev, will be settled there. But the basis of this is in Pasuk Yud Chet with v'chol afike Yehuda yilchu mayim. And then the last part, both of them are connected with the place of the Shechina, right, where Hashem is dwelling. Here we have the Ma'ayan Mibeit Hashem, and here it's Hashem Shochen B'Tzion. So in the last pasuk in the last pasuk of Yoel, we see that the Beit HaMikdash, it's the focus of the picture. And this pasuk established that Hashem is going to dwell in Yerushalayim. So here we have that in pasuk Yud Chet. Sorry, it's a little confusing with Yud Chet and Chaf Aleph. That it describes the water, it's flowing from Heichal Hashem. Okay, that's where it's coming from, and it's watering the Nachal Shittim. And this imagery, it's the description of it's reminiscent of the description of the river which comes out of Eden and it would water Gan Eden. And we see that there are many commentators that liken the Beit HaMikdash to Gan Eden. Okay, so through this, the Navi is likening the two of them. And the motif of the water coming out from the Beit Hashem, it can also mean that the Beit Hashem turns into the source of the fertility of the land and the source of the abundance, because Hashem is in the Mikdash. Both of these parts end with the presence of Hashem in the Mikdash, and this presence is what actually brings a material presence of abundance, right? God's presence is going to bring this material bracha. So when we look at pasuk Yud Chet here, okay, and each of them when we look at pasuk Yud Chet and we look into the internal structure of this pasuk itself, we can also find really interesting ideas within the 4 sentences here. Okay, so we have the first sentence of the wine flowing, and then we have the milk flowing, and then we have 2 sentences describing the flow of water. Okay, so here the liquids are organized by the degree of value, right? The most valuable one is described first, and that's the wine, right? And then we have the milk, which is second in value, and then we have the water, which comes last. And also, the place from which they flow, it's also organized by its topographical height, right? The wine is flowing from the mountains, Harim, which are the highest points, and the milk is from the Gvaot, which is the hills, the lower point. And in the third sentence, it's saying the Afikei Yehuda, those are the riverbeds, right? The channels of water. And the last sentence here, that it's going down beneath the ground to a spring, right? Because that's what a spring is. It's water that comes from beneath the ground, right? So the fact that this water is going beneath the ground, it turns this sentence into the climax, right? Out of all of these, if you see that all of them are flowing from top until bottom, this is the climax of these 4 sentences, because here it's coming from beneath the ground and the direction has changed, right? It's the complete opposite direction. When everything is coming from up to down, here it's coming from down to up, okay? So this gradual structure of these 3 sentences until the lowest point in the 4th line, it highlights the structure of the units, where all of the parts are aspiring to this last point, this climax, right, of the unit. And this structure, which is created from this motif of descending and ascending, it highlights the idea, which comes from that last line, is that the source of all of this abundance is from Beit Hashem. It's from the Beit HaMikdash. So the land, the mountains, the hills, and the riverbeds, they're all flowing with wine, milk, and water. And the source of all of this abundance from the Beit HaMikdash. And that last line, it shows the exception, which is the spring, it's coming from Beit Hashem. And it's the source of the waters, which is the water for the Nachal Shittim. And the role of the sentence is it's there to highlight that Beit Hashem has God's presence in the land. When we look at the internal structure of the second section here, these last 3 psukim, these last 4 lines, right? So we see here the first line, it has this desolation, and that's in contrast with the 3rd line, right? So here, it's an alternative. Instead of it going down, you see alternative that Aleph is parallel to Gimel and Bet is parallel to Daled, okay? So if you look at the first sentence with Mitzrayim being desolate, that's in contrast to Yehuda, which is completely populated and filled, okay? And here, if you look at the second line, the sins of Mitzrayim and Adom is through the blood spill of Yehuda. The fourth line returns to deal with this, right? That this time Hashem is not going to clean their blood. And this line ends the unit with an additional climax, the climax of Hashem Yishkon, Hashem Shochen B'Tzion, that God is going to dwell in Zion. Okay, so also in this concluding line, the Navi is emphasizing a new situation where he sees the place of Hashem that's in the Beit HaMikdash. So Professor Eliyahu Assis asked the question here, what's the meaning of the division of these concluding psukim into these two parts? Right? What is these concluding verses? What is it coming to teach us about the entire Sefer? So each one of the two parts that we see here, it's relating to one of the two themes in Sefer Yoel that he's dealing with. So the first section of the book, which comes in Perek Aleph, from Perek Aleph Pasuk Bet till Perek Bet Pasuk Chav Zayin, it speaks about the plague of the arba, of the locust. And if you read this inside, it shows this destruction of how the locust literally came over and completely took over the land. And there was a complete agricultural destruction. And before the state of Israel, I'm not sure exactly which year it is, in the beginning of the 1900s, historians describe that a very similar situation of locusts taking over, and there was a plague, and there was a huge agricultural destruction, and they had no way to combat it. They would try to make noises to get rid of them and spray them, and they weren't successful in combating them, because they literally came and they laid their eggs and they took over. And if you read inside Sefer Yoel, which we won't do because we don't have time to read inside, you see this description that's really matched with what happened in Israel in the beginning of the 1900s, which is just very interesting. And there's also the drought that's described there. The second section of Sefer Yoel, in Perek Gimel Pasuk Aleph through Daled Yud Zayin, we have the political destruction that's going on by our enemies, by Mitzrayim and Adom, of the destruction where they take over and they disperse Am Yisrael. So here we have in Pasuk Yud Chet, in the end of our parak, what we're talking about here, in Pasuk Yud Chet, we see here that it's the conclusion of the first section of the book, which is speaking about the agricultural, economical plague. And the second section here, the conclusion of the second section of the book, is referring to the Makamidili, the political destruction that we went through. So really, in these concluding psukim, we can see it's really highlighting and reflecting both of the themes of the book. Okay? Now, if we look at here, so I'm just going to go down. Okay, if we look at this next section, the first section of the concluding psukim, that when we're talking about the agricultural destruction, it's dealing with the material redemption of Yehuda, right? Through the motif of this flow of liquid. And we see a description of the opposite situation than by what's created, what the arbe, the locusts, create. Okay, so if you look here, we have these direct contrasts. This is our Pasuk Yud Chet, and the four different lines there, right? And here, each one has a Pasuk that parallels it, that's the opposite. And our Pasuk is showing the repair, right? The tikkun of what's going to happen, that redemption that will happen. So for example, here we see that there's this flow of wine. When you look in the first part, Hakitu shikorim uvechu, it's very poetic. Uvechu vehalilu kol shotei yain al asis. Wake up, you drunkards, and weep. Wail, all you swillers of wine, for the new wine that is denied you. Right? Because there's no wine anymore. They have nothing to drink. They can't drink that wine anymore, right? And here, if you go down here, to the bottom one, Umayan mebeit Hashem yetzei vishkat nachal hashitim, right? That spring that's going to come from out of the Beit HaMikdash, it's going to come out and it's going to water the nachal shittim. That's in direct opposition to earlier on in the first parak of Yoel, where it says, Hachrat mincha v'nesech mebeit Hashem, avlu hakohanim mishartei Hashem, right? The mincha, the offerings and the water libations, they've ceased from Beit Hashem because the locusts have taken over agriculturally, and so therefore they can't bring these offerings and they can't bring these libations. They can't pour the wine on the mizbeach or the water, and the priests are mourning over this. Those that are serving God. So you have that mourning, and that we can't bring to the Beit Hamikdash. And here, from the Beit Hamikdash, you have this spring that's just flowing, and that's the tikkun. Right, so these concluding psukim, it's describing this new situation, our new reality, the repaired reality, which is absolutely different from what was. Now, if you would read this, you would expect that the repaired reality would be when we have this agricultural abundance. It would enable us to once again come and bring the nisachim and bring the menachot. But however, that's not the description here, interestingly, right? Interestingly, the Navi is describing here that the Beit Hashem is the source that will fertilize the land, right? From the abundance of the water that's coming from the spring. It's rather than us bringing the libation and the menachot, right? The offerings. It's really God's house that's going to give the water to its surroundings. And also in the second section, right, it's describing the opposite as well of the Chorban Beit HaMikdash, of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, right? It's describing the opposite of the land and the nation in the year 586 when the destruction happened, BCE. When it's talking about that the land is going to be populated once again, and Hashem is going to settle there, we're going to be brought back. So our verses that we're speaking about here they're a conclusion and a summary for the entire Sefer, right? The two central themes of the agricultural plague and the political destruction are reflected in this structure, this tight structure, and the conclusion of the book. Now, the theological focus of these two themes is the question really is that they're asking, is God with us, right? That's the question that's going on with it. We have this complete destruction where we have this plague taking over us, and the locust is pouring down on us and pouring down on the land, and we have no way of working the land and having sustenance, or our enemies that are destroying us, destroying the Beit HaMikdash, sending us away. The question really is Hashem there with us? And so the answer to this theological question that we have, this challenge that we have, it's in the Sefer itself, right? And we could see that answer through here, that in Yoel he says, "V'yadatem ki b'kerev Yisrael ani v'ani Hashem Elokechem ve'en od v'lo yevoshu ami le'olam." Okay, this is in the middle of the Sefer in Parak Bet, right? The middle, right? Because there's only 4 prakim. It says, "V'yadatem," you should know that I am in the midst of Israel. V'ani Hashem Elokechem, I am Hashem your God. Ve'en od, there's no other. V'lo yevoshu ami le'olam, and my people should have no more shame. So the Malbim that looks at this pasuk, he explains beautifully. Shani mitamid liot bekirbam umitalech betocham. I've always been, and I always will be amongst them and walking within them. Ve'eni malhigotam be'emtzeut hateva, and I don't lead them through nature. Rak ani Hashem Elokechem ve'en od. Only me. It's not through nature. Everything that's happening to you is through me. Shahateva ve'amarcha en la shum koach, right? All the structures and nature, it has no power. Everything, hakol munhag behanhaga nis'it bli emtzai. Everything is through this hanhaga, this miraculous guidance, or without any intermediaries. Ve'az lo yavushu ami le'olam, right? And so therefore, when this happens, my nation, it will no longer have any shame. Because in the beginning it says earlier on, shelo yavushu mimaseh mara'im, that they should no longer be ashamed of their bad actions. And now it's coming to add, shelo yelem busha mitzad chisaron hashraat hashchina. They should no longer have that busha from the place of lacking God's dwelling amongst them. Right? Because how many times in our history have the nations mocked us and said, "Where is your God?" Right? I mean, there's stories of that in the Holocaust, of soldiers standing over Jews and saying to them, "Where's your God now?" Right? And that shame that we felt, like, Where is our God right now? ודברים שחסרו בבית שני, and the things that were lacking in the second temple, שהיו מורים על שאין השכינה קבועה ביניהם, right? We know that the Shekhinah didn't dwell in the Beit Sheni, things that happened that showed that the Shekhinah wasn't set amongst us, the way it was Mimei Kedem, as it was in the days of Shlomo HaMelech. ואז לא יבושו גם מצד זה. So in the future, they will no longer, right, in the future, in that day, Yom Hashem, will no longer be ashamed because of this. כי ישובו לקדמותם, because we're going to return to what we used to be. And when is this going to happen? וזה יהיה באחרית הימים. This is going to be at the end of days. בבוא זמן הגאולה העתידה. That's going to happen in the times of redemption in the future, as we're going to see through the different signs that are going to happen. Okay, so in the future, we're no longer going to have that shame and that question, right? We're going to know nothing is going to happen through just nature. Everything's going to be this miraculous way of running the world. God will run the world without any emsaim. There will be no intermediaries. It's going to be this direct. God is running the world, and later on in the end of Yoel in Pasuk Yud Zayin, v'yedatem. Once again, we see that word, right? V'yedatem, that you should know. Okay, because if you have that question, here's the answer. You should know. Ki ani Hashem Elokechem shochen b'Tzion har kodshi. I am God who's going to dwell in Zion, the mountain, my holy mountain, Vayita Yerushalayim Kodesh, and Yerushalayim is going to be holy. V'zarim lo yavru va'od, nevermore shall strangers pass through it. So here in the answer, right, we see the answer to that theological question of, is God amongst us? Hashem is saying to us, yes. I am here, I'm going to be here, and that Yom Hashem, God is going to dwell here, is going to be permanently in Yerushalayim. And this is the emphasis in both of the concluding lines, right? The first conclusion that we saw, that Uma'ayam mi Beit Hashem Yitzei, that spring is going to come forth from the house of God. And the second last line of conclusion shows that it closes the book with Vashem shochen b'Tzion, and Hashem is going to dwell in Zion. And just to conclude, I wanted to bring in, because I think that this theological question that Professor Eliyahu Assis is bringing up, that question that Yoel is answering, that we should know that God is with us and that He will return to us in a way that it will be eternal, that will no longer have that shame. I wanted to bring in an article that my husband showed me. It was an article that was in the New York Times, written by Elie Wiesel. Master of the universe, sorry that it's underlined. Master of the universe, let us make up. It is time. How long can we go on being angry? More than 50 years have passed since the nightmare was lifted. Many things, good and less good, have since happened to those who survived it. They learned to build on ruins. Family life was recreated. Children were born. Friendships struck. They learned to have faith in their surroundings, even in their fellow men and women. Gratitude has replaced bitterness in their hearts. No one is as capable of thankfulness as they are, thankful to anyone willing to hear their tales and become their ally in the battle against apathy and forgetfulness. For them, every moment is grace. Oh, they do not forgive the killers and their accomplices, nor should they, nor should you, Master of the Universe. But they no longer look at every passerby with suspicion, nor do they see a dagger in every hand. Does this mean that the wounds in their soul have healed? They will never heal. As long as a spark of the flames of Auschwitz and Treblinka glows in their memory, so long will my joy be incomplete. What about my faith in you, Master of the Universe? I now realize I never lost it, not even over there, during the darkest hours of my life. I don't know why I kept on whispering my daily prayers and those one reserves for the Sabbath and for the holidays, but I did recite them, often with my father, and on Rosh Hashanah Eve with hundreds of inmates at Auschwitz. Was it because the prayers remained a link to the vanished world of my childhood? But my faith was no longer pure. How could it be? It was filled with anguish rather than fervor, with perplexity more than piety. In the kingdom of eternal night, on the days of awe, which are the days of judgment, my traditional prayers were directed to you as well as against you, Master of the Universe. What hurt me more, your absence or your silence? In my testimony, I've written harsh words, burning words about your role in our tragedy. I would not repeat them today, but I felt them then. I felt them in every cell of my being. Why did you allow, if not enable, the killer day after day, night after night to torment, kill, and annihilate tens of thousands of Jewish children? Why were they abandoned by your creation? These thoughts were in no way destined to diminish the guilt of the guilty. Their established culpability is irrelevant to my problem with you, Master of the Universe. In my childhood, I did not expect much from human beings, but I expected everything from you. Where were you, God of kindness, in Auschwitz? What was going on in heaven at the celestial tribunal while your children were marked for humiliation, isolation, and death only because they were Jewish? These questions have been haunting me for more than 5 decades. You have vocal defenders, you know. Many theological answers were given me, such as God is God. He alone knows what he is doing. One has no right to question him or his ways. Or Auschwitz was a punishment for European Jewry sins of assimilation and or Zionism. And isn't Israel the solution? Without Auschwitz, there would have been no Israel. I reject all these answers. Auschwitz must and will forever remain a question mark only. It can be conceived neither with God nor without God. At one point, I began wondering whether I was not unfair with you. After all, Auschwitz was not something that came down ready-made from heaven. It was conceived by men, implemented by men, staffed by men, and their aim was to destroy not only us, but you as well. Ought we not to think of your pain too? Watching your children suffer at the hands of your other children, haven't you also suffered? As we Jews now enter the high holidays again, preparing ourselves to pray for a year of peace and happiness for our people and all people, let us make up, Master of the Universe, in spite of everything that happened. Yes, in spite, let us make up. For the child in me, it is unbearable to be divorced from you so long. So that's a very, I think, speaks for itself, very powerful words by Elie Wiesel. And I think that in Sefer Yoel, when he speaks about these two different types of destructions that was brought upon the nation by the hands of God, right? The locust came about and the political destruction, and we had that question, that burning theological question: is Hashem still with us, right? And I think that Elie Wiesel leaves many question marks because there are a lot of answers, there are a lot of questions that we cannot answer about the suffering of the nation. But what we do have are the eternal words and the eternal promises of God that, since they have not yet been fulfilled, we know that we can wait for them longingly, of that day where it says, "V'yadatem ki b'kerev Yisrael ani," and you'll know that I am with you and that I'm your God and there is no one else. V'lo yevoshu ami leolam, and my nation, we will never have that shame anymore. Vashem shochen b'Tzion, God is going to dwell in Zion. U'ma'ayan mibeit Hashem yetzeh, and there's going to be this spring of water that's going to come out, and it's going to be the source of our abundance, of our spiritual abundance and our material abundance as well. Bezrat Hashem shenizkeh to see those days in our times.